session panel. Over the course of the session, you can expect a traditional session in which speakers give presentations with a QA discussion section at the end. Also, as a reminder, a few of Americans for the Arts policies related to accessibility, which is a part of our ongoing work to pursue cultural equity. First, we at American for the Arts believe that amplification benefits everyone and that no one should need to request that someone use a microphone in order to be heard, understood effectively. As such, we have instituted a policy that anyone who is saying something that is meant to be heard by the entire room must use a microphone. In the same vein, please refrain from side conversations as they are disruptive to your fellow attendees and can keep them fully hearing the session content. Thank you for attending the annual convention.
Thank you, Carolyn. Let's give her a round of applause. Thanks, Carolyn. Hi, everyone. I'm Clay. And maybe before we do our presentations, we'll do just brief introductions of each of us. So this is going to be a little more informal, just by the size of the room and also by who you've got on the session. So I have a little bit of a presentation, Maud has a little bit of a presentation, and then we'll bring Yossi into a dialogue and hopefully all of you into a dialogue as well. But I'm really excited for my part to have this conversation. I've been, and I'll talk about this more, but I've been really deeply working on social impact as a communications and research strategy for a couple years now. And it's really interesting how that onion keeps getting peeled and how it becomes more and more complicated as we continue to try and have the dialogue about how social impact can translate into conversations that are meaningful to decision makers and the general public in communities. So I'm excited to get into that. But Maud and Yossi, do you want to maybe just briefly introduce yourselves and then we can get into the conversation?
I'm Maud Lyon. I'm the president of the Greater Philadelphia Cultural Alliance. So I have 452 member organizations in the whole region of southeastern Pennsylvania and parts of New Jersey and Delaware. So I'll talk more about that, but what we do as an organization is we do advocacy, we also do marketing and audience engagement, and we do a lot of research about arts and culture. So we're particularly interested in how we frame the narrative and how we give organizations tools and ways to talk about themselves and their own work, but also how we also talk to opinion leaders about the sector. So I like to describe my job as I spend half my time talking to civic leaders about why they should support the arts, and the other half talking to people who lead arts organizations about, here's what you ought to be doing for the community, get with the program.
Hi. My name is Yossi Sergeant. I'm a cultural organizer based out of Sleepy Hollow, New York, which is actually a place. I moved there about 8 months ago, so it's hard to say that it's home, but I'm an Angelino at heart. I'm a practitioner in this space. I just completed a project called We Rise in Los Angeles with the Department of Mental Health, where we invited 250 visual artists to present work and an additional 100 artists to perform and to participate in panel conversations. We had about 40,000 attendees come through the door. We had a partnership where we had students come through the day, and then the nonprofit sector used the space as a convening vehicle in the afternoon, and then in the evenings we were open to the public. The intersection between impact, local organizing, impact, and cultural strategies is my work. For context and why I think I ended up on the stage, I'm also the former White House Arts Liaison under Obama and Director of Communications for the National Endowment for the Arts.
Thank you. All right. So I've got like 10 slides, I'll run through them relatively quickly, but I wanted to give some context for why I and Americans for the Arts are sort of in this space. I don't know if any of you were in the session I was in yesterday. There's some overlap, but it's also new stuff, so it'll be fun. How many of you know what the Arts and Social Impact Explorer is? And have you used it, or how many of you have used it, or like taken it for a spin? Okay. Cool. So let me just give a quick background on that. And this is an ad, incidentally, that ran in the Chronicle of Philanthropy. And that's one of the strategies Americans for the Arts has, is to put easy to access ways to mess around with social impact and understand the role that arts are playing in all sorts of other places into the hands of public and private sector decision makers, in this case through the things that they read. So this will run in the Chronicle of Philanthropy. We're also potentially putting this in Roll Call or Politico or whatever, places where public and private sector decision makers go to sort of read and get ideas. And so what it shows on the right-hand side there is the Arts and Social Impact Explorer itself. It's like a Wheel of Fortune style tool that underneath it includes a lot of different data. It includes over 1,000 data points and example projects drawn from all over the internet and various research institutions that together illustrate the role that arts plays in 26 different sectors that exist in most communities. So it's everything from religion to environment to health and wellness to various types of social justice to transportation. And it's designed so that you can, it's basically gamified. It's designed so that you kind of can get into it, you literally spin it, you literally click things, and you can kind of move through and see little stories, little vignettes. In terms of the research, it's designed for people who don't want to read all the research, which is most of the people. And so it does that thing that researchers find annoying, which is distill it down to the one-sentence communication bit that is actually going to wrap people in. But in all cases, what it does is it allows people who want to dive deeper. So all of the different research bits and the two-sentence descriptions of a project and the pretty logos and pretty pictures, all of them are linked and clickable, and you can get back to the original core sources, you can get back to the original websites, all of that stuff. So we designed this, and I will say this is the end of what we designed. The beginning of what we thought we were going to design was a set of doorstop research reports on arts and intersections. And we got through creating most of one about arts and the environment, and we realized that no one was going to read it, and that was probably not the way to do it. And so we had some dialogue where we started to think about the fact that sometimes Americans for the Arts, but I think also we as the arts field, sort of get in our own way in terms of thinking we have to tell everyone everything about what we're doing. And that instead we need to get into a place where we are trying to offer people like the first hit, not the whole thing, and that they can then go as deeply as they want. And it turns out that that works. So since launching this officially in October of last year, it has consistently been the most popular page on our website. And for those of you who visited our website, that's a lot of pages. And it's been looked at by over 16,000 people. 9,000 people have downloaded. We created kind of glossy, pretty PDFs for each of these 26 sectors that you can download and print out so that they can hand them out to decision makers. So over 9,000 people have done that. And the part that I like the best is that they've stayed on the website an average of 6 minutes for each visit, which in web time is about an eon. And what that says is that they are actually doing it. They're playing, they're diving, they're moving it around, they're exploring what the arts do in their community. All of that is wonderful. All of that has also meant that we've gotten a lot of feedback from local communities. Maud and I have had some really good conversations. We've talked to local arts agencies in St. Louis, Seattle, Reno, various other places across the country. And they've had a lot of great things to say, and they've also had some suggestions. And the dominant thing that has been a kind of constructive suggestion is it's great, but it isn't about my thing, my community, my industry, whatever. We've also heard this from private philanthropy. So program officers are, in a way that I would never have anticipated, really thrilled with this product because it allows them to explain the existence of their programs to the heads of their foundations who are trying to cut the arts funding. Corporations are really interested in this because for a couple reasons. One, if you're in the CSR space, has to do with being able to say the arts should be part of our CSR portfolio. And if you're not in the CSR space, we have a lot of corporate folks who come to this because they are advocates inside corporations for doing things like integrating arts into health or integrating arts into HR policy or whatever, and they like being able to access it really easily. But they feel like right now it's a little bit non-specific. It's in trying to pursue that surface of the lake feel, we have made it so right now it's not as ripply as it needs to be, basically. that it doesn't show the way that it needs to what happens in a local community. And so this has driven us to ask this question, which is how do we make it proximate? If proximity is the thing that people are looking for, and also from other research, we know proximity is the thing that people think about first, and I'll get into that a little bit more. How do we make something like this tool proximate to any community that wants it, any industry that wants it, whatever? So that's a big challenge. It's a really, really big challenge because it turns out that people don't agree on what they care about most. So community to community, they don't agree. Industry to industry, they don't agree. These are 3 lists. The one on the left is from the National League of Cities. They do an annual thing where they dig through the speeches of all of the mayors that are members of the National League of Cities, and they codify what percentage of the time they're talking about different issues. And so that's how they make this list. The second one, the one in the middle, is from CECP, which is one of our strategic partners, and they created a report that basically looked at how corporations are spending their CSR dollars. And so you'll see that that's the only place that arts and culture exists as its own thing. It's number 7 on that list. And then the last one there is the general public. So that's from our own public opinion polling that we do every year. And one of the things we've added is a question that asks them, independently of anything having to do with the arts, what's the most pressing issue in your community? Now, we do it as a multiple choice question, so these are the 11 choices we gave them. And it may be that if we made it open-ended, they would come up with other things, but we were trying to get sort of relative frequency of answers. What's interesting about these lists in the context of this conversation is that there's not a lot of consistency. So, and it's even more challenging than that because all of these lists change from year to year. So in the case of government, for example, economic development is always number 1. But numbers 2 through 10 change places all the time. So 4 years ago, health was the 10th. This 2019 report, or 28, I guess, the most recent one we've got, which is not this list is a little old, health is 3rd. And so it bounces around. Education has done the reverse. It's gone from being 2nd to being 10th in any given year. We don't think that is any sort of major trending thing that says mayors don't care about education. It has to do, I think, with whatever's going on proximately in terms of time. What's going on in communities right now? There's a lot of health issues in communities. There's a lot of opioid crisis things going on. So health is obviously something people talk about more. So what that prompts is that whatever we're going to make has to be flexible and has to allow for people to be able to sort of indicate where they care about, what they care about. And there's a really important reason to do this. So this is from our national public opinion polling work that we did. It's a little bit of a complicated thing to read, but so this represents 5 different ways that we asked the question, do you favor or oppose funding of arts and culture? And so if you look at the green lines, the verticals, the one that's all the way on the left, that is, do you favor or oppose funding for arts and culture at a federal level? The next one is state, the next one is local, and then the last one on the right-hand side is, do you favor or oppose government funding of the National Endowment for the Arts? And what you can see is that those lines sort of move upwards in terms of what they represent left to right is the amount of people who say they agree. So only a little north of 50% of the people who we asked agree with the idea of federal funding for arts and culture. And the number increases when you specify the National Endowment for the Arts. But if you look at the top 5 rows of this graph, so education, health and wellness, jobs in the economy, environment, public safety, and race and community relations, you'll see that that purple bar goes beyond the green. What that means is that when we ask people, do you favor or oppose government funding of arts and culture to address education issues, 83% of people are on board. When you ask them specifically about health and wellness, 73% of people are on board. So when you pair arts and culture with a thing that most people care about and are concerned about in a way that is more proximate to them than arts and culture, they get on board. This to us sort of represents, it's an illustration of what we call the abstract versus specific value problem in the arts. And what that basically means is that in theory, people are really on board with arts and culture. 90% of people say that arts and culture makes community life better. 75% of people, 3 in 4 people, say that arts and culture is a great driver of the economy. But when you ask them to do specific things, like vote in favor of people who support the arts, only about a third of people say that that's something that they take into account. And when you ask them to give to the arts, only about a quarter of people say that they'll give to the arts. The reason that this is an illustration of that is that the more specific you can get, the closer you can get to a sort of specific use of the funds, the more likely people are to say yes. It gets to a question of instrumentality for art being something that people are really into in the United States, and an avenue towards increasing public support for things like funding and policy. So this is a different set of information, but just really quickly, we also survey local arts agencies all across the country every year. Some of you may get our annoying emails a couple times every week for a few weeks when we're doing the surveying. And one of the things that we have taken to asking is, what do you have work that currently relates to these 26 different areas that we've identified in the Social Impact Explorer? And what we're seeing is that there's a lot of commonality, which is great. So everyone, by and large, is doing arts, or not everyone, but they're doing health and wellness work at about the same rate all across the country. But there are a couple places where that is not true, and so this is an illustration of that. So in terms of arts and economic development programs, there's about 3/4 of all of the local arts agencies in the West have an arts and economic development effort, but only about half of them in the Northeast do. And if we look at housing, while these numbers are smaller, it's about double the number of organizations in the West that are doing arts and housing projects to those in the Midwest. This basically is just an illustration of varying priorities, because 97% of all local arts agencies have between 1 and 3 non-arts partnerships at any given time. So it's not a question of do you do work with other sectors? Almost everyone does at this point. It's a question of which of those sectors are the most prioritized in your specific community. So we're all about trying to figure out how to give them what they want. And what they want in this case is something that goes from this, which is a more nationalized version of a lake, right, to something that looks a little bit more localized. And so if we think of the Arts and Social Impact Explorer as this lake, what we're looking to do, and this is where I sort of am talking about something that's coming down the pike, you're the first to know, how exciting, is we're looking to gather up the other national data sets that we have, our arts and economic prosperity data, our creative industries data, our public opinion polling data, the profile data we do for local arts agencies, as well as social impact. And we're looking to funnel all of those into basically the Social Impact Explorer on steroids, create a kind of giant reservoir of information that is tagged by county, so that we would create an interface where you could go to this website, you could input the county, we're looking at also being able to input specific arts and sections that you're interested in, and it would then spit out something like these Arts and Social Impact Explorer fact sheets that we already have that was very specifically designed for you and your community. All of it using a computer and, a complicated database and no human interaction. So that we can get to the place where for all 4,500 of our local arts agency members, as well as anyone who's working in those communities, they can have a dialogue with their local decision maker that is based in their local projects using national information and cross-references their local creative industries data and how many creative workers they have, their local economic impact data and how many dollars they're generating in the community, and example projects drawn from down the street, in order to begin to have exactly the dialogue you want to have with your local decision makers. So it's early days. We're looking for ideas and input. I hope we have a great conversation. And that's that. Thank you.
Awesome. I always learn something. I just realized I brought stuff to hand out and I forgot to do it. So Carolyn, if I can draft you, I'm going to hand you things. So we're also interested in looking at social impact and how that plays out in specifically, in our case, in Greater Philadelphia. And so, oops, I've got the little clicker thing. The big green button. Oh, the top green button. Got it. So we started about in 2017 doing reports on specific areas of social impact, and the strategy behind this and being passed out is our recent one, hot off the press actually, which is on aging. So we named the series Agenda, and each one focuses on a different topic. So you see on the screen Agenda Pre-K, which talks about early childhood development, and then Agenda Wellness with the famous Gross Clinic painting on the front cover. That talks about the impact on doctors and diagnosis and physician burnout. And then Agenda Aging, which you have being distributed to your tables, talks about the impact of the arts on basically healthy aging. What we're doing for each one of these is we look for existing research that's out there in the world, someone that's done far better research than we could ever do. Then we link it to examples of actual organizations in our area that are doing that work. So like my favorite example from Agenda Pre-K is a professor at Westchester University swabbed the mouths of 3-year-olds in a preschool program at Settlement Music School before and after arts activities, and found that the cortisol level in their blood goes down, and if they have multiple arts activities over time, it goes down even more. So literally you're talking about kids growing up in toxic stress situations having their brain development improved because they're singing and dancing and drawing. And so those kinds of things are things where people go, oh, I never thought about it that way. An example from Agenda Wellness is the Philadelphia Museum of Art does training in uses art to train doctors in basically for diagnosis on their observational skills. It also has a 26% improvement in their empathy with patients because they're actually looking at you. So we also got interested, similar to what Clay just said, in how this plays out in donors and in support for the arts. And we did a research project last year that resulted in this report, Beyond the Check, a roadmap for engaging individual donors. There were 3 parts to it. We did confidential interviews with high net worth donors who don't give to arts and culture to find out, and one of the things we found out from them is that they tend to think the arts and culture is the opera, the symphony, the orchestra, the ballet, the art museum, and that someone else has got them covered. They have no idea about the vast array of what arts and culture really includes. We also did a survey of actual arts donors to ask them about their priorities, and one of the things we learned, similar to the data you were just showing, is that only 30% of them give to arts as their first priority. So again, if you can link it to another cause, and the top-rated causes were education, human services, environment, religion, and social justice of various kinds. So we got interested in, we'd already started this work, but we got interested in, so how much of this is going on in our region, and what kind of impact is it having collectively across the sector, not just as individual examples. So we decided that we would do a census of all of our member organizations and try to find out what they were doing. So our goals were to discover what kind of social impacts they're actually working on, to document the impact of that sector-wide, and this was really a first step, so this isn't a deep dive analysis yet, to identify topics for future issues of our agenda series and to understand just the dynamics of how does this social impact work play out on the ground. So what we did was we developed a list of topics. We used SurveyMonkey. This was actually research on the cheap. We determined what kind of response we needed to be statistically valid. So we literally divided between very large, mid-sized, and small organizations and set target goals for how many responses we wanted to get. And we separated our 440-some members into different size cohorts, and we sent the survey out last summer. And this is the list of topics. You also have that on the cards in the orange box of all the topics, which pretty much parallel what AFTA's looked at as well. One of the reasons this was successful, we got 179 organizations to respond, is that we had our entire staff calling people and individually saying, I need you to fill out this survey because statistically we need 8 more organizations in your budget size. And we know our members well, so we know we literally, different staff people called different organizations that they worked with. So this was in our government relations vice president's office, literally this thermometers of how many organizations had answered this survey. So in 3 weeks, we got 179 organizations to respond. So here's what we learned. There's more than 1,000 programs every year that deal with social impact in our region, and they happen in 2,000 locations. 65% of those locations are in some place other than the home of the arts organization. They're in a library, a park, a community center, a prison, a school, a religious organization. They're somewhere where the people are that they're trying to reach, not at the home of the arts organizations. We found that translates to 181 programs every week, and that includes programs that explore racial justice in schools, which start as early as elementary and pre-K with that work. It also includes a lot of accessibility, sensory-friendly programming, theaters that have, and performing arts that have special performances. We also found a number of organizations that work with incarcerated populations in various ways. Homelessness and housing insecurity was another area where we had 57 programs happening in homeless shelters and more than 65 in health and wellness spaces. We also looked at how long organizations had been doing this work. And so we found that there were a number of organizations that had done whatever their topic was for a decade or more, some of them for many decades. And no surprises there, education led the pack with 88 organizations specializing in that. But we had more than 150 organizations that were working in areas of accessibility, historic preservation, child development, and the environment. We also found that our organizations were responding to evolving community needs. 44% of the programs that people reported had just started in the last 2 years, and those tended to group around topics like immigrants and refugees, homelessness and housing insecurity, addiction and recovery, and LGBTQ issues. Also others, but those were the ones that stood out, and also aging, hence our agenda aging this year. One of the things that really stood out to us is that there's 2 ways that cultural organizations work with these topics. One is touching hearts and changing minds, our ability to communicate to the broad public about an issue and educate people about an issue and get them to understand it and then care about it. And no one's going to advocate for change if they haven't first gone through that journey. So whether it's a museum exhibition or a theater production, doing things that touch hearts and change minds is a really important impact. And as you can see, that focuses around things like racial justice, particularly in like theater performances, anti-violence, LGBTQ, economic revitalization. Interact Theater had a great piece last year on gentrification, which was really interesting, called Salt, Pepper, Ketchup, about South Philly. And then changing people's minds about an issue and educate them about it was one way. The other way is changing the lives of the affected populations, having programs that are working with kids growing up in toxic stress situations, people who are incarcerated, people who are addicted or in recovery, people who are homeless, a lot of mental health, autism, and a lot of programs with aging and Alzheimer's, not just with the affected, but also with their caregivers. So our next step in our process was that we then did kind of informal focus groups. We gathered together several of our member organizations. So the first group was the long-haul decade or more group, and we talked to them about what it is that made it work for them and what were their challenges. What they learned was that they bring their unique skills as an arts organization to the issue, and it helps to give voice to that issue. They emphasize that you've got to experiment, be humble, and expect that you're going to make mistakes and learn that way. They all said start small, get good partners. They all said nothing about us without us. You have to include the people who are in the issue and working on the issue as you're planning those things. And if you know one person with name your issue, you know one person with that issue, that you really have to be aware of the diversity, whether it's the autism community or the incarceration community or racial justice or what have you. The 10-year or more group all said that the two things that challenged them most, one was inconsistent funding. All the funders want to do the pilot project. As soon as you've proved that you're really good at it and you've gotten it to be efficient, they want to move on to something else, and that's a real challenge. The other is for many of these organizations don't have a facility. I mean, they have an office, but they don't have like a place. They do their programming in other people's facilities, and that lack of having a building or visibility they felt was also a problem. We also then gathered the group that had been working just in the last 2 years, which included a wide range of organizations from theaters to Live Connections, works with WXPN Radio. PhillyCam is a public access media organization. Philly Sculptors does public art, and the Please Touch is a children's museum. What they'd learned was partner with community experts and, again, use your art to give them voice. Interestingly enough, a lot of the people they'd partnered with were the 10 years and more group. So that we didn't expect was that they actually crossed over. They've also partnered with other community partners. And the patterns that they've talked about is that they might or might not continue with their topic. It might be something that was a theme of their concerts or their theater productions in 1 year, but not necessarily something they were going to commit to for the next 5 years. They might move on to other topics. But they were all focused on social justice and really amplifying the issues. So let me conclude with just a couple of specific examples. We have lots more, but Artreach is an organization that's been working for, well, about 30 years, I think, on accessibility for the arts. So that's both financial accessibility with their low-priced Artreach Pass, where you can go to any museum for $2 and your whole family can pay $2 a person each. But they also do a lot of training to arts organizations for how you work with communities with disabilities, and that it's not just all about ramps and wheelchairs. It's about how you talk to people, how you welcome them. They've been providing discounted training to our member organizations as part of our partnership with them. The College of Physicians, which is better known as the Mutter Museum, has a wonderful program that is STEM training for LGBTQ youth. They have a similar program that's for immigrant girls. So they're really reaching to those populations. It's partly getting people into the pipeline for those kinds of careers, but it also is a support group for kids in those particular groups. They also have an annual story slam for doctors, where doctors tell stories about what it's like to be a physician. The Pennsylvania Horticultural Society has a program. The City Harvest Program allows people to raise extra vegetables and contribute that to homeless centers. And Roots for Reentry is about training people in horticulture who have come out of prison or re-entering community. The mural arts, our famous mural arts, this is an example in our municipal services building of murals they did. This was a temporary installation of people who are incarcerated, so literally all the city agencies walk through that door. But they also have a program that in southeast Philadelphia, where they're working with communities, largely refugee and immigrant communities, most of them from various parts of Asia. And they do art, but they also have language translation services. You can apply for social services. They have, citizen education programs. So it's a safe space that they've created where people can come in, speak their own language, be with people who are like themselves, do art, but also get help for their various issues in the community. And my last example is Eastern State Penitentiary, which is this sort of hub-looking like thing. You can see the center city, Philadelphia, in the distance. This is a historic prison that was built in 1829, and at the time it was built, it was actually a revolution in prison design. That was the time when people just, threw people into, group prisons, basically, that were incarcerated. You'd get tuberculosis. It was pretty nasty. The idea of this and the reason it's called a penitentiary is that in those hubs, every one of those are separate cells, so you had your own personal space where you could repent. You also had a private exercise yard, so you had access to sunlight. It had flush toilets before the White House. So they've done a number of things, and this is part of the Changing Hearts, Changing Minds. So this is in their courtyard, a big graphic that literally shows how the racial makeup of the U.S. prison population has changed. It also, on the red part, compares countries that have the rate of incarceration the rate of crime in countries with capital punishment, without capital punishment, and basically makes the point that there really isn't much of a difference. They have an exhibit. They did a lot of testing with the public to find out what messages resonated, and this is what one was saying: mass incarceration isn't working. So whatever political persuasion you are, that's a statement that can reach you. And this is just one example from that. They have this display that shows that in 1970 and 2015, the rate of violent crime was actually about the same. 1972 was when this prison closed, and 2015 was about when they did this exhibit. But then you look at the rate of incarceration and the comparison of 1970 to 2015. So there's a lot more in their exhibit, but they went so far as to change their mission statement to say that they interpret the legacy of American criminal justice reform from the nation's founding through today in the long-abandoned cell blocks of America's most historic prison. By the way, this is what the outside of it looks like. So two final things. One is there were literally 300 prisons around the world that copied this in the 19th century. So, I mean, including Japan and Europe and all kinds of places. The other thing is, since you're looking at the outside walls of Eastern State, they have a project that's going to happen this August and September, where they've been working with people who are in prison to create video art that is going to be projected on the outside walls of Eastern State Penitentiary in a series of presentations in August and September, and then they'll have discussion groups in the coffee shop across the street. So these are examples. So just to conclude, the benefits of social impact for individual organizations is that we did this census and we did this work so that individual organizations would understand better how to share their story. But also to encourage, we also reported on this at our annual meeting, to encourage organizations to get into this space, to start doing this work if they weren't already. For the sector as a whole, it helps to change the narrative that arts and culture is not just a frill, it's a way we understand the world, it's a way we heal. So really being able to get that across in very specific ways. It also, and what the agenda series is about, is building allies. That's why we do them as separate reports, because those all have different constituencies that use them. The people who care about pre-K, the people that are in wellness, the people in aging, and other issues we'll do later. And then finally, it also is a way of demonstrating the range and reach and relevance of the sector. With that,
So Yossi, do you want? So you can, if you want to offer some remarks, please do. Otherwise, we can also just start a conversation, whatever you feel. I think it's automatically on. Oh, you turned it off. He's so conscientious. He actually. Okay.
I don't have anything formal to present. First, I would just want to say thank you both. First of all, I want to use your tool. And as a practitioner in this space and somebody who's been doing this for a decade now, over a decade now, the transition, for so long, the traditional arts funders looked at the work that I did as politics, and the political and social issue funders looked at what we did as cute. And the transition over the last 10 years has been phenomenal, and it's because of the seriousness that this community has taken to showing the impact and showing the real, to be able to quantify the impact of this work has made the case much easier for each of us, and I think that's why you're seeing people spend so much time on your page. And to have those tools to be able to present that work is tremendous, so thank you so much for that. I would just say the challenge still remains in my work that I am often seeking art dollars to do work in racial justice, or I'm seeking racial justice capital to do work with artists, and that that the dollars have been slow to move to understanding, the intersectional dollars have been slow to manifest. And my hope is that this work continues to become quantifiable in such a way and taken seriously in such a way where we can move those dollars towards the center from both sides.
Well, and I think I think that is a great observation, and it echoes something that we talked about a little bit yesterday, and I've had other conversations about here, which is that there's sort of a dual challenge of practice and communication, both of which are currently not where they quite need to be. So, and I think you sort of illustrate the sort of cusp of practice in a lot of ways. And I think that, and Maud, what I think you're finding, or what it seems like you're finding from the data, is that there's a lot of stuff happening, and some of it is deep and specific and persistent, and some of it is, I did a show on this thing. And right now, there's no significant differentiation because we're just sort of learning about the whole body of it at once. So that's part of it. And then on the other side, there's a communications challenge where you've got the social justice people, the racial justice people, the transportation people even, who think that this is adorable and something that's like a novelty. And then on the other side, you have the arts funders who worry that this is mission drift for them, that we've got so few arts dollars, why would I put arts dollars into what's essentially a community development project or a racial justice project? Do you, either of you, have thoughts about how we bridge those gaps? Because I think that this is supposed to really be a conversation about localization, right? So localizing this so that people in local communities can take action. And I think in most local communities, there's both a sort of practice question and a communications question that need to be addressed, ideally on the fewest number of dollars possible and with the least time, because everyone's doing too much.
Well, part of the strategy of this is looking for dollars that aren't dedicated to the arts. Like the Mural Arts Program in Southeast Philadelphia is actually funded by basically the health part of the health department of the city of Philadelphia, who put major funding into it. A lot of the health and wellness programs are funded by funders who wouldn't fund the arts, but they're going to fund something on aging or autism or something like that. So part of this is having arts organizations look more broadly and show that they really are having an impact and serving people, and it opens up new avenues for funding. So I think that's part of it.
Yeah, I would, again, as a practitioner, I would say that in the last 15 years of work, this is the first year that I've received any arts dollars. And I've raised somewhere in the range of $14-15 million worth of non-arts related dollars to pay for arts-driven social impact work. The pool of money that's available outside of arts dollars is far deeper, and to be frank, it is the Wild West in terms of their understanding of how to play in the space, and most of those funders tend to be pretty frustrated with the getting the same kinds of offerings.
Right.
And when somebody comes to the table with a different offering that has some kind of a measurable impact attached to it, and they tend to be excited. And so the challenge then becomes in maintaining that kind of regular and sustained effort, because those are cute dollars. Those are let's experiment dollars.
Right.
And that doesn't create balanced and sustained work. And that creates opportunity to test and to try for somebody like myself. Which is great for piloting projects. It's not great for building sustained organizations.
Right, yeah. Well, and I think it also demonstrates a level of commitment that is maybe less than the level of commitment we're ultimately seeking. So the idea that they're supporting experimentation on one hand is great, but it also means that there's a sort of proof of concept that's necessary to progress beyond that.
Although I would, like when a theater does a program that, like Disgraced, if any of you have seen it, is a very moving play that's about being Arab American and both the prejudice against you, but also the cultural forces within you, where in the course of the play, this poor guy's life falls apart because of those two forces. Things like that, what I'm interested in is how can we connect these up? That's one of the reasons we did the census, because an individual organization might have, some organizations have a program that focuses on racial justice that they've been doing for a long time, but there's maybe, 100 people a year that are in that particular program. But the cumulative impact of having that in different ways, I think, is very different. So one of the things we're looking for is how can we take people in the community who care about these issues and say to them, did you know that this exhibition is happening? Did you know that, this production is happening? And so that we can do a better job of having people see how they can use the arts for that. I mean, part of what we're really talking about is social change. How do we create the space where people can talk about these issues and understand them? And exhibitions and theater are great ways of doing that. So I think one of the things we have to work on in the like local arts agency, art service organization space is how do we not have this be little drips of separate efforts? But how do we start to connect it so people see that cumulatively this really does have an impact? That's why we did this census. And that's why we're trying to understand who all is working on these issues or that issue, so we could connect them better to each other, but also so we could connect them better to other people in the community that care about those issues. So I think part of the consistency is on us to maintain that. I mean, the funding, no question, is a problem. But it also is a matter of how do we... you can also do the flip side, like I realize you're using theater a lot, but, a theater is going to do, 4 or 5 shows in the course of a year. They're going to raise the money to do that. That actually is a way of having attention on, say, racial justice in a way that isn't being funded by racial justice dollars. It's being funded by the theater company. So I think it's really all of this is about how do we connect to what our community cares about, and because what we're seeing is people haven't had arts education in 40 years. So the opinion makers and the influential civic leaders in all of our communities simply don't have any visceral reaction to music or poetry or it's really astonishing. And it's not just underfunded city schools. It's also more affluent schools and charter schools that often are missing this kind of work. So we're starting from a public that doesn't understand that the arts is part of what makes you human and part of what connects us to each other. So we're really having to do a rear guard action here to convince people why they should care. So another way of looking at this is that it's about how do we take issues people do care about, use the arts to talk about them, and in so doing, get them to understand why the arts are important.
Right. The analogy I use, there's a psychological process that you are sometimes told to do if you're depressed, which is to smile even though you're not happy, and eventually the pheromones will kick in and you'll be happy. And so you're basically teaching yourself to smile or teaching yourself to be happy. And I feel like that's the stage we're in with some of this social impact stuff. Is the first step is to simply say, you care about education? Look, the arts are in education, and so therefore you should care about the arts. And eventually, ideally, with enough of that progress, you can get to a place where, 1, they naturally draw the lines, and 2, they don't have to tack it onto something else to think that it's valuable to them in their lives.
Well, and Yossi, I'd be interested in your experience because I think one of the places we miss the boat in the arts community is how do we message this? I mean, that's another reason for us looking at this across our membership is any individual, a museum, an arts education organization, a neighborhood center, they're doing fantastic work, but they each, get about that much attention. Mm-hmm. There's not the arts journalism that there used to be. Nobody reads just in our case, the Inquirer, but the local paper. it's getting harder and harder for us to even reach people. One of the things I worry a lot about is that the internet is really good at sending you to whatever you're looking for, but it's really bad at surprising and delighting you with something you didn't know you would be interested in. And so how do we message about these things and about the arts and try to connect with people? Because I feel like we're not doing a good job of that.
And while Yossi's answering that, you all start thinking of your questions, which hopefully you have some, and then we'll get into some Q&A with you all as well.
Yeah, so it just so happens that I'm working with a great organization in California called Create California that are working to build energy and momentum underneath arts education across the state of California, and we're asking these very questions right now. And what we're finding is the approach that we're taking is similarly, we saw really great campaigns starting in San Diego, really great campaigns happening in Alameda County, really great campaigns happening in Sacramento, but the sum of the parts weren't adding to much more than those individual parts, and that the vehicle, the vessel for containing that energy was being held by each of those individual organizations while they were being activated locally. The energy, as the responsibility for maintenance of that energy, was oftentimes above the capacity of some of these organizations to build and maintain. Some of these organizations don't even have digital leads inside their organizations. They don't have the modern communication structures that are required to maintain the kind of energy and the kind of presence in people's lives to stay relevant, whether you're local or national. If people aren't coming across you in their daily engagements, you're not on the radar, period. And so most of these organizations, or a lot of these organizations, don't even have that capacity. And so layering on top of the kind of sum of the power of each of these organizations, a campaign that says, if we're ever going to tackle the myriad of issues that we're facing every day, that census list, we need a creative electorate. We need a group of people who look at the world and have the ability to imagine and the ability to look beyond the obstacles. That says that creativity is not optional, and thus getting into a conversation about arts education is the approach that we're taking there. I always use the same example, and they didn't really like hearing this when I said it, but arts education has a really bad brand. It's probably one of the most broken brands in the art space. If you actually do a Google search for arts education and then hit the image button, it's like finger painting with kids, with their hands up smiling, which is great, but not a very strong brand, because you walk into the room and you say the words arts education, what happens? Oh, yeah, I'm so sorry that you guys don't get enough money, and all the problems come up, all the sadness and all the deficit comes to mind, right? You don't need to, while that may be what the work looks like, that's not actually how you necessarily need to sell the brand, right? The U.S. Army doesn't recruit soldiers by showing pictures of war, right? What they actually do is not how they sell their brand. They sell their brand with heroics and, dragons and swords, right? Which is not actually what the U.S. Army does. But so how they attract people to the work doesn't necessarily look like what the work actually is. And oftentimes in social impact work, when we're talking about the arts, what we're really talking about here in narrative is we're saying the arts are as important in solving all of these issues and are as relevant as all of these issues without directly naming it. And then once you engage people in that work, then you can directly name it, and instinctually people understand it. What I find is most of the activists that I work with that are working in any of these spaces, most of the issue-specific organizations that I engage with instinctually understand the role that in storytelling and the role of the heart connection and the emotional connection that people have to their issue as expressed through the vehicle of arts is. There's no sale required. They get it. They just don't have the tools or resources and the team to do that execution. And so they are extremely willing partners for arts leaders and arts organizations that want to come into that work and engage with them on it. Where the bridge lies, and to get back to the question, is in scalable communication. And what I think where I fall in this is thinking of the work that we do both as the work and as communications interventions. So, we may do a project that has 30,000 people that come through the door on site, but I'm equally thinking about how that work is going to scale in as a communication structure as I am as the local impact of that work. So, the project we just completed had 2 pieces of I want to call them Instagram moments that we designed in. I feel a little dirty describing it like that because they were made with artists, but it was basically Museum of Ice Cream for Mental Health.
Do you all know the Museum of Ice Cream?
It's exactly what you think
It's a San Francisco thing, if that may be enough. But do you want to describe it briefly?
Basically, people were paying $30 to walk into a door and sit in a pool of sprinkles, or to be in a banana split Instagram moment where it was designed for you to take a selfie, and they were so popular that they sold out 6 months in advance, and they extended by 2 years, and it has now manifested a whole nationwide plague of purely aesthetic-driven environments that are they're beautiful, they're great, I love them. And
pictures are very pretty.
They're very pretty. But so we compete in that marketplace, and so we create and generate opportunities for people to take a selfie with something that says everybody deserves to take up space, right? And we do the same thing with a statistic that says that California built 22 prisons and 1 university since 1980. Massive data viz, massive, beautiful, arts-driven information that is scalable culture, and both of those projects had above 13 million shares. Not 13 million views, 13 million shares. So if you start to think about, if you think about local and direct action, but with scalable communication culture on top of it, and you get the professionals in place who understand how to do that work, we can play at the table with any corporate and with any. That's what artists do, right? Artists create those kinds of distilled visual, right? The power of the stroke of a guitar, the strum of a guitar, the click of a shutter, the delivery of a poem touches at that heartstring that makes for the best Museum of Ice Cream moment ever. And if we can connect the local action with that kind of content and with a team of people who know how to scale it, you can be relevant and local, but with a national impact and visibility as well.
There you go. All right, who has questions? It's late in the day. You might not, but if you do, look, there's one.
I have followed some of the census process with the Greater Philadelphia Cultural Alliance, and I think I've seen the survey, but maybe I didn't see the whole survey, but I think I've seen the whole survey, and it looked to me like you didn't actually get specific programs, that it was asking how many programs do you do for this topic and where do you do these programs, and it was very grid-based. So what I'm wondering is, how did you follow up with the 179 respondents to find out what was the program that they do that addresses housing or that addresses autism, or you know what I mean? So that you could begin to gather the actual descriptions of the programs and connect those sectors.
No, that's a good question, and this is in the crawl before you walk, walk before you run. We felt it was important just to quantify how much of this is going on and how much is it going on in different topics. So we literally have, a database now of the organizations that are doing it. We've convened a number of groups to then have conversations, not just 10 years and up and 2 years and less, but also we convened a group around aging that are all working on that. So part of that was helpful because it just introduce them to each other. Another piece is we do know our member organizations well, so a lot of these we already were familiar with. So clearly there's a lot more to do to try to drill down and understand more deeply what they're doing. And I love what you said about how do we communicate it, to really think about how do we tie that to messaging and communications. One thing about the arts world is that 80% of our members have budgets of less than $1 million. So you're talking about, there's organizations like Mural Arts or Eastern State that are highly visible, but there's an awful lot and things the Philadelphia Museum of Art is doing. The museum is very visible, but their programs with Alzheimer's, for example, not really. So the next stage will be to say, how can we drill down more deeply and understand that, both by connecting the people working on this to each other, but also on looking for where's the opportunity to be able to then take that to the next level of communications collectively. The other thing is, how many small organizations have a full-time marketing person? So we're looking for ways to be able to aggregate and package this, and there's a lot more to learn.
And will you also try at some point, do you think, to reach the other member organizations that didn't respond? And then I'm also thinking about what practices might be occurring among artists who are not members of the Greater Cultural Alliance, and how have you thought about whether you might be able to capture that as well at some point? I know this is...
Yeah, it's just all about our own capacity to be able to do that. We have traditionally worked with nonprofit organizations, although 20% of our members are in through Culture Trust, which is basically a fiscal sponsor and provides back-of-house support for all of them. So we do have connections with a number of those arts projects as well. Part of this is us staying after this. As we continue to do the agenda series, as we continue to do this, it's kind of, let's not let perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's start out, let's get people interested in it. We first presented a version of this presentation at our annual meeting, which is the biggest single gathering of the cultural community every year. There's 500 people that come to that. So we said, 179 of you answered this survey. We're telling 500 of you what we learned. We don't have plans to do this. We don't see this as like trying to measure and how many this year. It's really more about really understanding the shape of it and then informing the next steps that we take.
Well, and I think one thing that is interesting there too is that in this being the sort of the crawl stage or the walk stage, it also sets up a sort of, now you can see the whole landscape, but you can't necessarily differentiate between the different types of rock. So you've got these two gross categories that you were able to do. One of the things that we're finding, and we found as we developed the Explorer, is that both the research and the evaluation bodies of literature on things like this are relatively weak. There's a lot of research out there, but on the scale of research for people who actually do research, it's fairly basic. There's a lot of correlative things, but not a lot of causal things that can be said in a lot of places, particularly for some of the less well-known intersections. So like we chose arts and health to dive more deeply into because it was the largest body of literature we had, but a good chunk of it was either correlative or just theoretical, the research literature that was out there. And the same goes for the projects. So you saw 1,000 projects. I would love to know how many of those projects had any sort of evaluative mechanism associated with understanding the social impact that they were having, as opposed to being able to say this is a project related to Alzheimer's. And the thing is that that's not unusual. Arts organizations, particularly for the fact that so many of them are so small and so strapped and also are in the business of making art, not evaluating art, don't put evaluation into their structures in the way that would be necessary, for example, to say to someone who was skeptical of you, this has an impact. And so we're trying to figure out how to deal with that, because the answer isn't to tell them that they have to, because they can't, or they won't, or possibly both. So we've been toying with the idea, for example, of trying to work with a foundation to create a pot of money that would partner research universities with cultural organizations that are doing
Well, and
social
that's what we're doing actually, because for instance, we are from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'm at a research university, UNC Charlotte, and then the Arts and Science Council. We have partnered actually to do this very kind of thing, we hope, down the line, but
Right.
starting with a survey and a census and a gathering effort to find out what's happening in our region, and then hopefully down the line being able to pair those things with researchers at the university to then do the evaluation and all. So we'll see.
And I just want to, I would even say, like, I'm really excited we're even having these conversations, because this is huge progress, right? You know, I ran marketing for Rock the Vote for a bunch of cycles, and one of the things that we did was we partnered with Pandora to look at what songs were most played in very specific regions, right? I currently have a client of YouTube, and I can tell you what words are being searched at in certain neighborhoods for higher, what TV shows are being watched at, right? So even I would argue that this conversation is looking at a very particular kind of data.
Right.
And that data is looking mostly at the nonprofit industrial complex, right? Which doesn't always reflect the true fabric of a community, right? We got recently worked with the California Endowment, which is a healthcare organization looking at social determinants of health in California, and we're working in a city. Really, it's thermal. It's outside of Palm Springs. It's people in really hard conditions and no access to public transportation, very little access to water, shade, really just bad situations. And into going in there to start to engage young people into organizing their community, we started to do a cultural mapping of the space, and everybody wanted to say, oh, and here's the youth organizations, here's the nonprofit that's handling this. And what we actually found was that there were 2 garages where the kids were gathering and playing rock music, like punk rock music, where there were more young people going to those garages to play music than there were attending any one of those arts organizations. And they both of those young people who own those homes had higher Instagram followings than the combination of all those nonprofits in the area. So I just say, like, I'm not even sure the data that we're looking at is even the correct data. It's a great place to start. But ultimately, if we want to look at impact, there's actually a more modern and a more sophisticated conversation needs to happen later down the road.
No, that's a really important point. I mean, another thing is that I remember getting a fundraising flyer from the Salvation Army that prominently said they did arts and culture programs. I mean, we don't own this space. There are, I mean, that's a perfect example. There's a lot of good work on social impact that's being done using arts and culture that isn't in, and I think something that we all have to be aware of is the nonprofit is just I mean, basically allows you to get grants. It's not a business model. All it is a tax structure, and it's very limiting in a lot of different ways. It also is very much a kind of WASP undertaking. You know, I mean, it is really based on the model of you get volunteers, they're on a committee, they make a board, they get together, they raise money, they do it. You know, I mean, it's a very kind of WASP way of looking at the world, which has done a lot of really
WASP,
good
like
things.
white Anglo-Saxon,
like
like
white
WASP?
England,
Okay.
Anglo-Saxon Protestants. By
love
the way,
that.
by the way, that term was invented in Philadelphia. No accident there. And so especially in communities of color, a lot of this work is happening, but they don't do it. They do it through their faith-based organization. They do it in their garage. They do it with their neighborhood kids.
Church choirs.
Church choirs, you know, are really, really huge. They don't feel the need. In fact, there's a disincentive for them to form a 501c3 because they're not going to get the grants and they're not going to, you know, it's just not worth the trouble. So I think it's important that this social impact work is not just about how do we make a case for the arts and get people to support the nonprofits. I mean, we're an advocacy organization, we do that. It's also about how is this important to the community and how do we use the arts to address really important community issues. And I think it's an opportunity for us to build bridges with the part of the arts community that is not in the nonprofit sector. And that is a whole nother conversation and something that deserves a lot more attention.
Yeah, there's a great organization in Los Angeles called the Burrito Project, which is like completely unaffiliated with any arts organization, right? These are a bunch of kids who get together at midnight and they ride their bikes around and they go to one park together and everybody brings a can of beans and they turn on the music and they bike trick for each other, and everybody brings a can of beans, tortillas, cheese, lettuce, and they roll burritos, and then they take them to Skid Row and they pass them out. And this is an impact-driven project that's culturally focused and driven, and is probably equal to the amount of money that is, or the amount of impact in terms of feeding people that some of the nonprofits are in the same space, and it's totally off everybody's radar. And the inverse of that conversation is to say, can we look at what's happening on the cultural side, on the pop cultural side, or on the active cultural side, and say, how are they playing in the impact space, and how can we model off of how they're working as well? Again, I think that I'm just super excited we're starting in this space because we haven't had this much focus on mapping out this work in some time. I think it started with this kind of social practice arts organizations that have been, as we've seen, done it for 30 years, but felt like they were islands out in the world. We've all pointed them as the best of practice, from Apple Shop to Spark in Los Angeles, to, we can point to these organizations across the country who have mandates of impact as part of their driving efforts, but we haven't really been able to look at this, at the fabric as it plays out across a city with any sophistication, and I'm really excited that we're starting to get to a place where we can do that work.
So we're at time, and I just want to say thank you to Maud and to Yossi, and we can, how about, well, so let's see. Do we want to, how's everyone feel about one more question real quick? Let's do it.
This has to do more with the messaging and working particularly in rural communities, where I truly believe that the whole world is not on Facebook, not on Instagram, not online. So it's great that there's printed material, it's great that there's data, but how do you affect the change? How do you do that in terms of the messaging and trying to reach people? And I think I'm looking at Yossi for an answer.
There are a lot of people, I would argue that in those places, they all know what the Game of Thrones are. Or many young people are. I would argue,
is that your way of saying culture is broader than?
I would say that that the reach of culture penetrates even the most remote corners of the world. And to say just because people have a lack of access, which of course the digital divide is real, and lack of access, and when we look at the scale of generation, it is true. But my mother, even though she's an urban dweller, and is very hip to what the kids are doing these days. And it may not be because she herself is coming in contact with it online, but she is part of her kids are talking to parents or talking to grandparents, and what we need to do is to articulate the natural communication structures that exist in communities. And with my mother, it looks very different than what it does with my peers. So I did the Hope posters for Obama. And most people know that one image that we did with the red and the blue and the image in the middle. But what we actually did was we did 3,000 art projects over the course of the campaign. And we did video game nerd art for video game nerds. And we did knitting projects to reach a very particular audience. And we did bike spoke cards to reach a very specific audience. And what we did was we found the vehicle, the appropriate messenger, the appropriate message, and then we articulated that line of communication. So whether it's on Facebook, or you're doing it through bake sales, or you're doing it through folk art, or you're doing it as Apple Shop does on the radio, it's about finding that correct line of communication to penetrate. I would just say people are more connected than you think they are. Even across that digital divide, culture reaches them. But if you know that there's a strong digital divide in the community that you're working with, what are those articulated, what are the potential articulated lines that you can get to? And then try to think about the best method and the best messenger for those. And that is always, fail none, it's going to be an artist. It's going to be a cultural practitioner who is going to be able to look at those and be like, I know the best way to activate this radio, this print, this bake sale, this whatever it is. Fail none, history proves it's always the artists that know how to do it.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Enjoy the rest of the evening and tomorrow, and safe travels home. And thank you to Maud Lyon and Yossi Sergeant. I'm Clay Lord. Thanks so much.